The Crofter Who Vanished Before Dawn, a Hamish Macbeth Mystery, Chapter 1. The mist clung to the slopes of the Sutherland Mountains like a damp, woolen blanket, muffling the world until Lochdaviv felt less like a village and more like a secret kept by the earth itself. It was the kind of morning where the air tasted of wet stone and peat smoke. PC Hamish Macbeth, currently draped over the back of a wooden bench outside the local hotel, felt perfectly in harmony with the weather. He was watching a spider traverse a dew-heavy web between two fence posts, with the kind of intense, scholarly focus usually reserved for criminal investigation. In reality, Hamish was simply waiting for the hotel kitchen to open so he might negotiate a breakfast of bacon and eggs on credit. Lugs, his mongrel companion, was curled into a tight, muddy ball at his feet, periodically twitching in a dream involving large rabbits. Hamish himself was, as usual, a picture of strategic unkemptness. His uniform was rumpled, his red hair was a riotous thicket of disarray, and his eyes were glazed with a deliberate, performative vacancy. He was the very model of a village constable whom any self-respecting police force would deem entirely unsuitable for promotion. It was a reputation he guarded with the tenacity of a dragon. "Morning, Hamish," called out Elspeth, the hotel maid, as she propped open the heavy front door. "If you're looking for work, the drains behind the kitchen are acting up again." Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound that seemed to pull at his very limbs. "Ouch, Elspeth. My back's been playing up since the frost set in. I was hoping for a bit of a quiet morning to rest. Maybe a coffee. Just a small one?" "You're a lazy, useless man, Hamish Macbeth," she said, though her eyes softened as she poured him a cup of coffee. "There's a new car parked down by the lock. A bright yellow convertible. Looks like it cost more than the entire village budget. Some man in a velvet jacket is pacing around it, kicking the mud as if it's an insult to his tires." Hamish took the coffee, the heat blooming in his chest. A yellow car, in Lochduff. That's like wearing a neon sign in a graveyard. Must be a Sassenach. Someone looking for the authentic experience, while staying as far away from it as possible. He finished his coffee, and, with a heavy reluctance, began the slow shuffle down toward the water. The owner of the yellow monstrosity was indeed a man of profound irritation. He wore an expensive velvet blazer that was rapidly acquiring a coat of Highland damp, and his hair was styled in a way that defied both wind and gravity. As Hamish approached, the man rounded on him, his face contorted in a sneer. "Finally," the man barked, his accent clipped and aggressive. "I am Julian Vane. No, wait, that's not right. The name is Sterling, Arthur Sterling III. I am a property developer, and I've been sent here to discuss modernizing the derelict croft at the edge of the glen. I've been waiting 40 minutes. Where is the representative? Where is the local authority?" Hamish stopped, leaning back on his heels, his mouth falling open in a display of slow, blinking confusion. "Property developer, is it? We don't have much call for developing, sir. Things here tend to stay where they were put mostly." "Don't give me that rustic nonsense," Sterling spat, pacing the gravel. "I have a vision for this place. Glass, steel, eco-cabins. I've already bought the rights to the old croft from the absentee owner. I expect the local council to facilitate my needs, starting with someone to clear out the current squatter. I believe his name is Dougal. A stubborn old goat, I'm told." Hamish's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, a spark of calculation hidden deep beneath the lazy haze. He knew Dougal. The man was a pillar of the village, a man whose family had worked that land since the clearances. The idea of this preening peacock in a velvet jacket coming in to pave over history with eco-cabins made Hamish's stomach tighten. "Dougal doesn't take well to being told what to do," Hamish said softly, his voice drawling and thick. "He's a man of the land, sir. He thinks your glass and steel are just a bit of a fancy way to catch the rain." "He's an obstacle," Sterling said, adjusting his collar with a sneer. "And obstacles, constable, must be removed. I suggest you start doing your job, or I shall be making a very loud, very expensive phone call to your superiors." Hamish tipped his cap, a slow, mocking gesture of compliance. "I'll see what I can do, sir, but it's a misty morning, Things have a way of getting lost in the glen. He turned and walked away, the morning light catching the red in his hair. He hadn't just made a vow to protect the village from the arrogance of the outsider. He felt a prickle of dread. Dougal hadn't been seen at the pub for 2 days, and the idea of this man trying to bully him made Hamish's skin itch. With a sudden, sharp, and entirely unlazy instinct, the game was afoot, and he was quite certain he wasn't going to like the next chapter. Chapter 2. The following morning dawned with a sky the colour of a bruised plum. The mist having thickened into a wet, clinging har that erased the world beyond the village street. Hamish Macbeth was in the midst of a particularly strenuous bout of inactivity in his office, his feet propped up on the desk and his gaze fixed on a small, spider-occupied corner of the ceiling. He was contemplating the merits of a breakfast of cold porridge versus the effort required to walk down to the hotel. His ruminations were interrupted by the frantic rattling of the station's door handle. It opened to reveal Elspeth, as if she had seen a ghost. Her face was pale, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and her hand was clutching the edge of the doorframe as if to steady herself. "Hamish, you have to come," she cried, her voice trembling. "It's Dougal." I went up to his croft to deliver some mail, and the door was wide open. "The place is in shambles, Hamish, and there's blood." Hamish didn't jump. He didn't rush. He slowly lowered his feet to the floor, his face adopting an expression of mild, slightly confused annoyance. He stood up with the heavy, unhurried grace of a man who was perpetually inconvenienced by the demands of the world. "Blood, you say?" he asked, his voice slow and thick. "Maybe he just cut himself on a fence, Elspeth. You know how Dougal is with his repairs." "It's not a fence, you fool." Elspeth snapped, her frustration overriding her terror. "Come on." Hamish grabbed his cap and whistled for Lugs, who emerged from beneath the desk, tail wagging with a sense of impending adventure. They drove up the narrow, winding track toward the glen, the Land Rover splashing through puddles that were deep enough to swallow a wheel. The croft was a lonely stone-built structure nestled against the base of a crag, a place where the silence of the mountains was the only constant companion. When they arrived, the scene was indeed far from the result of a simple fence repair. The front door of the croft was hanging off one hinge, and the interior was a disaster of overturned chairs and shattered pottery. In the center of the flagstone floor, a dark, unmistakable pool of blood had soaked into the cold stone, and a single, heavy boot lay abandoned near the hearth. Hamish stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room, not with the panicked gaze of an amateur, but with a quiet, clinical precision that his lazy posture completely obscured. He noted the way the chair had been knocked over, away from the table, not toward it. He noted the smear of mud on the windowsill, a different color than the local earth. And he noted, with a chill that he didn't allow to show on his face, that Dougal's favorite pipe, the one he was rarely seen without, was smashed into the fireplace. A deliberate act of destruction. "Stay back, Elspeth," Hamish said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its lazy drawl. "Don't touch anything." He stepped inside, his boots silent on the stone. He crouched by the hearth, observing the patterns of the blood spray. It was a violent, chaotic scene, but there was no sign of a body. Dougal had not just been attacked. He had been taken. "Hamish," Elspeth whispered from the doorway, her voice tight. "Where is he? Where's Dougal?" "I don't know," Hamish said, his internal monologue firing with a cold, sharp intensity. He thought back to the man in the yellow car, the arrogant property developer who had spoken of removing obstacles as if they were mere debris. He stood up, his face once again returning to its mask of sluggish indifference. He looked out the window toward the jagged skyline of the mountains. The mist was beginning to lift, revealing the harsh, unforgiving beauty of the glen, a landscape that hid secrets as effectively as it concealed the dead. "We have to call Strathbane," Elspeth urged. "We need more people." "Aye," Hamish agreed, his voice once again slow and drawling. "We'll need to call them, but for now, we wait. If there's been a struggle, there's a trail, and the mountains have a way of keeping track of who went where." He walked outside, breathing in the cold, damp air. He knew what would happen next. They would send that blowhard, DCI Blair, who would stomp around the croft in his polished shoes, ruining what little evidence remained, and would immediately conclude that Dougal had simply walked off into the mist. It was the easy answer. It was a lazy answer. But Hamish knew the difference between a man who had left and a man who had been taken, and he knew that the man in the velvet jacket was going to find out, quite soon, that the local authority was far more than a figurehead in a dusty uniform. He stood in the silence of the glen, his hands deep in his pockets, feeling the weight of the investigation settling on his shoulders. He didn't want the job, but he had no choice. Dougal was his, and Lockdow was his, and he would not let them be erased by a man who measured the world in profit and loss. He felt a cold, hard resolve tightening in his chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the freezing mountain air. The hunt had begun. Chapter 3. The arrival of Strathbane police was no discreet affair. It was, instead, a triumph of noise over necessity, heralded by the screech of tires on the single-track road, and a siren that seemed intent on waking every sheep for 10 miles in every direction. Hamish Macbeth stood outside Dougal's ransacked croft, leaning against the damp stone wall of the structure, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He watched with a profound internal resignation as the lead cruiser slid to a halt, spraying a fine mist of Highland sludge against his boots. DCI Blair emerged from the vehicle like a man preparing for a military conquest. He was a creature of loud colours and louder opinions, his face already flushing a dangerous shade of puce from the exertion of the drive. He caught sight of Hamish, who was currently doing an excellent impression of a man contemplating the slow growth of moss, and his expression soured instantly. "Macbeth?" Blair roared, his voice echoing off the crags like a gunshot. "What in the name of all that is holy are you doing, standing there like a statue, while a crime scene is clearly being compromised? Where is the victim? Where is the forensic team? And why, for the love of God, is there a mongrel dog currently sniffing the evidence?" Lugs, unbothered by the sudden surge in decibels, gave the bumper of the police car a thorough, investigative lick. Hamish blinked slowly. The action so measured it was almost imperceptible. "Morning, sir. Grand day for a drive, isn't it? The mist is thick, but I'm sure you didn't have much trouble with the road." Blair stomped up to him, his heavy brogues sinking into the soft mud. He was a man who measured his authority by how much space he could physically dominate. "Don't you dare give me your local yokel routine. You lazy, incompetent peasant. I have a report of a violent abduction. A man is missing. His home is destroyed, and the local PC is standing around waiting for the grass to grow. I want a status report, and I want it 10 minutes ago." "It's all as you see it, sir," Hamish said, his voice as smooth and slow as thick honey. "Dougal's gone. Looks like a struggle. We've kept the area clear. I was just thinking that perhaps the property developer from the village might know something, seeing as he was quite keen on having Dougal moved." Blair's eyes narrowed until they were little more than slits. "The developer? Sterling? You're talking about a man of significant social and financial standing. Macbeth, a man contributing to the local economy, and you're suggesting he's involved in a violent abduction. Based on what? Your amateur suspicions. This is exactly why you'll never advance beyond this miserable, God-forsaken village. You jump to conclusions that suit your own narrow, biased worldview." Blair turned his back on Hamish and marched toward the door of the croft, waving his arms at his team. "Clear this place out, secure the perimeter, and get this constable out of my way before he manages to mess up something else." He pointed a thick finger at one of his junior officers. "Take the witness, Elspeth, down to the station. I want a statement, and I want it to focus on any known disputes Dougal might have had with other locals. I'm certain this is a local grudge, a debt, or perhaps a dispute over land rights. It's always a local matter in these places. There's a predictable cycle of misery in these glens that you seem to relish." Hamish stood in the background, his face an expertly crafted mask of dull-witted bewilderment. He listened as Blair began shouting orders, assigning his team to search the immediate area for a body that Hamish knew wasn't there. He was doing exactly what Hamish expected. He was building a case around the most convenient prejudice, confirming narrative, completely ignoring the muddy windowsills and the deliberate destruction of the pipe. "You're going to be searching those hills for a long time, sir," Hamish murmured, though he made sure it was quiet enough that Blair couldn't hear. Blair turned again, his face dark with irritation. "Macbeth, go back to your station. File the reports. Keep your mouth shut and do not, I repeat, do not interfere with this investigation. You are officially sidelined. If I see you near the castle or the glen, I'll have your badge and your hide. Is that understood?" "Understood, sir," Hamish said, tipping his cap with an exaggerated, servile motion that made Blair's eye twitch as the Strathbane police began their loud, chaotic search. Hamish whistled for lugs. He didn't offer a final word. He didn't point out the inconsistencies he had seen. He simply turned and began the slow, measured walk back toward his Land Rover. He had succeeded in his goal. He had effectively removed himself from the official investigation, and in doing so, he had gained the only thing he really needed: the freedom to find the truth, unburdened by the ego and the bluster of the man who thought he was in charge. The real hunt, quiet and careful, was about to begin. Chapter 4. The village of Lochduff existed in a state of suspended animation as Strathbane police tore up the landscape. DCI Blair was currently up at the glen, his voice echoing off the hills as he bullied his juniors into searching every patch of heather for a body that Hamish knew, with a gut-level certainty, was not there. Meanwhile, the village itself had retreated behind closed doors, gossip travelling along the telephone wires and through the thin walls of the cottages. It was a silence that Hamish knew how to break, provided he had the right tools: a bottomless thirst for tea and a face that suggested he was thinking of nothing more complex than his next nap. Hamish parked his battered Land Rover behind the post office, a building that served as the true nerve centre of Lochduff. Mrs. McPhee was behind the counter, her face set in a grim, tight line. She was the one who processed the bills, letters, and secrets of every resident in the valley. If someone had made a move, she had seen the paperwork. "Morning, Mrs. McPhee," Hamish drawled, leaning against the counter and looking as though he might fall over if he didn't have the support. "Cold one today, isn't it?" DCI Blair's making quite the racket up at the glen. Making a man feel like a hot cup of tea is the only reasonable response to such excitement. Mrs. McPhee looked at him, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. She knew Hamish better than most, but she also knew the game he played. He's a loud one, that Blair. Thinks he knows the Highlands because he's got a badge and a megaphone. He was here earlier, asking for Dougal's records, as if Dougal's bank statements would tell him why the man was dragged out of his home in the dead of night. Hamish let out a slow, mirthless chuckle. He likes the easy path, as does the DCI. It's a lot less work than talking to the people who actually live here. "But I'm sure you've noticed something, Mrs. McPhee. You always do. Did Dougal get any unusual mail? Anything from the property developer, perhaps?" Mrs. McPhee leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He did. A letter, 2 days ago. Heavy cream paper, sealed with a crest. Dougal didn't even open it here. He tucked it into his jacket and walked out like he'd been slapped. And that's not all. The delivery man from the city, the one who brings the supplies to the hotel, saw a car parked at the end of the Crofter Road last night, a yellow convertible. It sat there for an hour, lights off, engine ticking in the cold." Hamish felt a sharp, cold focus settle in his mind. The developer, Sterling, was lying. He had claimed he was just interested in the property. But he had been stalking Dougal, pressuring him, likely trying to force a sale through intimidation. "Did the delivery man see who was in the car?" Hamish asked, his voice remaining casual. "He said it looked like Sterling, but he also saw someone else. A woman, tall, wearing a scarf pulled low over her face. They were arguing. Hamish. The man was gesturing wildly, and the woman looked like she was trying to calm him down. Or perhaps she was the one pulling the strings. Hamish thanked her, finished his tea, and wandered back out into the cool, biting air. He whistled for Lugs, who emerged from the shade of a nearby hedge. The puzzle was becoming clearer, and the motive was shifting from simple property greed to something far more intricate. If Sterling had a partner, someone who was perhaps more calculated and less prone to clumsy outbursts, it explained the meticulous way the croft had been turned over. This wasn't just a bullying tactic, it was a targeted search. They were looking for something Dougal possessed, a deed, a hidden document, or perhaps proof of ownership that stood in the way of Sterling's vision. His next stop was the curry shop, where Mr. Patel was busy wiping down the tables with a look of extreme distaste. Patel was the only person in the village who appreciated a good bit of intrigue, and he was always eager to trade information for a bit of company. "Blair's men have been here, Hamish," Patel said, his dark eyes glinting. "They asked about Dougal's friends. I told them Dougal has no friends who would hurt him. But I did tell them about the arguments. Dougal wasn't just fighting with the developer. He was fighting with his own nephew, who's been desperate for money lately. A real piece of work. That one," Hamish nodded, his face masking his surprise. "A nephew. Another layer of motive, another person with a reason to want Dougal out of the way." He walked back to his Land Rover as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. He had the pieces now: a greedy developer, a mysterious woman in a scarf, and a disgruntled relative. The official investigation was focused on a simple grudge, but Hamish knew the truth was hidden in the web of secrets that connected these people. He didn't need the forensics team. He had the gossip, he had the observation, and he had the quiet, persistent knowledge of who, in this village, was capable of playing the long game. He turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and headed into the gathering gloom, ready to unravel the mystery before the DCI could lock up the wrong person and call it a day. Chapter 5. The late afternoon. Light was fading into a bruised purple, casting long, mournful shadows across the manicured grounds of Glenmore, where the property developers had temporarily set up their base of operations. Hamish Macbeth steered his Land Rover toward the perimeter of the estate, his mind turning over the fragments of information he had gathered, like a man sorting through a handful of sea glass. He had the yellow convertible, the mysterious woman in the scarf, and the desperate nephew. What he lacked was the connective tissue, the reason why a humble crofter had become the target of such an aggressive, potentially violent campaign. As he pulled up near the gatehouse, a sleek, silver Jaguar purred into view, coming to a halt just feet from his own battered vehicle. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She looked as though she had been carved from marble, her regal posture and elegant wool coat providing a stark, almost painful contrast to the rugged, untamed beauty of the Highlands. Priscilla had been the bane and the delight of Hamish's life for years. She was everything he was not: wealthy, ambitious, and deeply concerned with social proprieties. Yet, in the quiet, unspoken language they shared, there was an understanding that transcended their different worlds. "Hamish," she said, her voice cool and crisp, cutting through the damp air. "I heard the news about Dougal. Please tell me you aren't doing something spectacularly foolish. The entire village is in an uproar, and DCI Blair is currently shouting at a sheep." Hamish climbed out of the Land Rover, shrugging his shoulders, as if to emphasize the sag in his uniform. "Och, Priscilla, I'm just doing my job, or rather, I'm trying to avoid doing it. But DCI Blair is making that quite difficult. He's convinced it's a local vendetta, and he's arresting the first person who looks at him sideways." Priscilla walked over to him, her eyes searching his face. She had long ago learned to look past the village idiot act. She saw the flickers of intelligence, the stillness in his posture, and the way his hands stayed steady, even when he was describing a crime scene. "Blair is blinded by his own desire to close the file," she whispered, stepping closer, so their conversation was lost to the wind. "He doesn't care about the truth, he cares about the optics. If he finds a convenient scapegoat, he'll take it. And Sterling is pulling strings in the background. My father mentioned that Sterling has been lobbying the local council for months to bypass the heritage protections on that croft. If Dougal had a legal document proving the land was protected, he would be a significant thorn in Sterling's side." Hamish felt a cold prickle of realization at the back of his neck. A deed, a hidden document. It wasn't just land, it was a barrier to a fortune. So, he wasn't just trying to buy Dougal out, he was trying to eliminate the legal barrier to his project. Exactly, Priscilla noted, her gaze drifting toward the estate house. And Sterling isn't alone. That woman seen with him. She's a legal consultant from London. She specializes in difficult property acquisitions. She's ruthless, Hamish. If Dougal stood in their way, they wouldn't stop at threats. You're thinking of a conspiracy, Hamish said, his voice uncharacteristically firm. That makes sense. But Hamish, you have to be careful. If you cross Blair, he'll have your badge before you can explain your theory. He needs a simple local story to sell to the press. I don't care about the badge. Priscilla, Hamish replied, his eyes narrowing as he watched the lights flicker on inside the main house. I care about the truth. Blair is busy bullying a nephew who probably just wanted to borrow a few quid, while the real criminals are sitting in there, drinking fine wine and planning their next move. If he makes an arrest, the real culprits walk free. Priscilla reached out, her gloved hand momentarily touching his arm, a rare, fleeting moment of intimacy that made Hamish's heart skip a beat. You're the only one who sees them, aren't you? The people the rest of the world overlooks. That is your strength, Hamish. Don't let your desire to be invisible cost you your integrity. She stepped back, her poise returning, as if she were afraid of showing too much concern. I must go. My parents are expecting me for the viewing. Just promise me one thing. Don't let him get away with it. I promise, Hamish said, watching her return to her car. As she drove away, the roar of her engine fading into the vastness of the hills, Hamish felt a renewed sense of purpose. Priscilla had given him the final piece of the puzzle. A motive rooted in corporate greed and legal maneuvering. He wasn't just a lazy policeman avoiding work anymore. He was a hunter. He watched the moon rise over the peaks, the silver light turning the landscape into a ghostly, monochromatic dream. The pieces were shifting. The picture was becoming clear, and for the first time that day, Hamish felt the thrill of the chase. He whistled for lugs, his companion responding with a sharp, alert bark. The night was young, and the truth, for all its darkness, was waiting to be found in the shadows of Glenmore. He adjusted his cap, ready to peel back the layers of a conspiracy that was much deeper than a missing Crofter. Chapter 6. The local holding cell, a repurposed, damp-walled storage room at the back of the Loch Dove police station, was currently hosting a symphony of misery. DCI Blair was pacing the narrow corridor, his face a mottled, angry red, his voice booming with the misplaced authority of a man who believed that volume was a substitute for intellect. He had spent the last 3 hours grilling Dougal's nephew, a scrawny, trembling youth named Finlay, who had been found hiding in a local barn with a handful of cash he had stolen from his uncle's kitchen drawer. It's not complicated, you idiots, Blair shouted, slamming a fist onto the wooden table for what felt like the 100th time. The boy had a motive. He had a history of petty theft, and he was found in possession of the victim's money. It's a classic crime of opportunity that turned violent. The boy panicked, attacked his uncle, and now we're looking for a body to confirm the outcome. This is closed by tonight, and I want the paperwork on my desk. Hamish stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed over his chest, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea that he had managed to cadge from the station's kettle. He watched with a detached, quiet amusement as Blair continued his tirade. Finlay was currently sobbing into his hands, his denials drowned out by the DCI's constant interruptions. He didn't hurt him, sir, one of the junior officers ventured, trying to sound helpful, though his voice lacked conviction. He says he only took the money because he's in debt to some lads in Inverness, and the house was already empty when he arrived. He swears he didn't see his uncle, which is exactly what a guilty person would say. Blair countered, his voice rising in irritation. It's the standard defense. My job is to recognize the signs of a perpetrator under stress, and I am the expert here. Hamish sighed, taking a slow, measured sip of his tea. He had spent the last 2 hours discreetly reviewing evidence against the physical realities of the crime. Earlier, While Blair was preoccupied with his dramatic interrogation, Hamish had slipped back into the croft. He had examined the muddy windowsill again, the one Blair had ignored in favor of the nephew's fingerprints. It wasn't just common dirt. It was a mixture of silt and a very specific type of synthetic rubber compound, the kind found in high-end, all-terrain tires used by commercial engineering vehicles. Furthermore, he had taken a closer look at the debris around the hearth, tucked into the crags of the stone floor. He had found a small, discarded brass fitting, a proprietary seal used in high-pressure glass installation system. It wasn't from a kitchen or a barn. It was from a construction site. Hamish entered the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "Begging your pardon, sir," he drawled, his voice pitched to sound as unthreatening and dull as possible. "But I was just thinking. If Finlay here had attacked his uncle, he would have left more than just his own prints. The window was open outside, and there's a brass fitting on the floor that doesn't belong to any household appliance I've ever seen. It looks like it came from a glass handling rig." Blair turned, his eyes burning. "I told you to keep out of this, Macbeth. Only your interference matches your incompetence. Get out of here before I have you suspended for obstruction of justice." That brass bit is probably just a piece of old junk Dougal, kept in his pockets. "Right you are, sir," Hamish said, tipping his cap with an exaggerated, servile motion. "Whatever you think is best," Hamish retreated, his expression carefully blank. He had done his part. He had planted the seed of doubt, even if Blair was too stubborn to acknowledge it. He walked out of the station and into the cool, biting air of the evening. Lugs were waiting for him, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the gravel. Hamish looked at the dog and offered a grim smile. "He's so convinced he's right, Lugs, that he's blinded himself to the truth. He's going to hold that poor boy until he's blue in the face. And meanwhile, the real killer is sitting somewhere, feeling safe, because the police have pinned the tail on the donkey. Sterling and his legal consultant have managed to manufacture the perfect scapegoat." Hamish turned toward the village. He knew where he had to go next. The killer hadn't just left behind footprints. They had left behind a pattern of behavior that was as clear as a fingerprint. It wasn't about the nephew's petty theft, it was about the corporate machine, and Hamish was the only person in Lockduff who wasn't looking at the obvious. He was looking at the shadows, and in those shadows, the truth was beginning to take a very distinct and very dangerous shape. He adjusted his cap, feeling the weight of the investigation shift from a nuisance to a necessity. The game was far from over. Chapter 7. The night air in Lockduff had turned razor-sharp. The kind of cold that seemed to seep through wool and skin to settle directly in the marrow. Hamish walked away from the station, his hands deep in his pockets and his shoulders hunched against the wind. He wasn't heading toward his cottage. Instead, he took the long, winding path that led up toward the construction staging area where Sterling's engineering firm had parked their heavy machinery. He was thinking about the brass fitting again, that small, overlooked piece of evidence that Blair had dismissed as old junk. To Hamish, who spent his days observing the habits of poachers and the subtle shifts in the behavior of the local wildlife, the fitting was a signature. It told a story of industrial precision, of high-stakes contracts, and of the extreme lengths to which a developer would go to ensure a project remained on schedule. As he reached the shadow of the staging area, he stopped. He pulled out a small, bent flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it toward the ground near a large, specialized glass handling rig. There, in the frost-hardened mud, were the clear, heavy impressions of large, all-terrain tires. They matched the tread marks he had found near Dougal's windowsill perfectly. He didn't need a forensic lab to confirm it. The pattern was unique, industrial, and distinctly tied to the company Sterling was using for his eco-cabin site preparation. He thought back to his earlier conversation with Priscilla and the rumors of Sterling's legal consultant. They hadn't just been interested in the croft, they had been hunting for the original deed of ownership. The one document that could prove Dougal's land was protected under an old obscure trust that effectively nullified Sterling's purchase agreement. Sterling hadn't wanted to buy Dougal out, he had wanted to erase him. A sudden movement in the darkness caught his eye. A tall, elegant figure emerged from the temporary site office, walking with a brisk, efficient gait. It was the woman from the yellow convertible, the consultant. She was clutching a thick, leather-bound folder to her chest, her face illuminated by the pale, cold moonlight. She moved toward a large transport van, her eyes darting nervously toward the darkness of the trees. Hamish extinguished his light and pressed himself into the deep shadows of an ancient stone archway. He watched as the woman climbed into the van, the engine roaring to life with a mechanical growl that shattered the silence of the glen. He didn't move. He simply watched, his mind cataloguing the facts. The discarded brass fitting, the matching tire treads, and now the panicked removal of files from the site office. The motive wasn't just greed, it was survival. If the deed were found, or if Dougal were ever recovered, their entire project would collapse under the weight of a massive legal and criminal scandal. He waited until the van had pulled away, its taillights fading into the gloom, before he approached the office. He didn't break in, he didn't have to. The door was slightly ajar, a testament to the haste of their departure. Inside, the space was a chaos of shredded documents and empty cabinets, but on the floor, snagged on the corner of a heavy metal desk, was a single, overlooked scrap of paper, a copy of an old survey map, highlighted in red ink, showing the exact boundaries of the land Dougal had protected. Hamish felt a sudden, sharp pang of realization. They hadn't found the original deed yet. That was why Dougal had been taken. They were still interrogating him, holding him captive somewhere, trying to force him to reveal the location of the document. He wasn't just a missing person. He was a hostage in a high-stakes, corporate-driven nightmare. It wasn't a crime of passion for the nephew, was it? Hamish whispered to himself, the cold air turning his breath into a ghostly plume of vapor. It was a corporate extraction. He stood perfectly still, letting the realization settle over him. The lazy policeman was gone. In his place was a man who understood the weight of secrets, living in the dark corners of the world. He realized now why the site had been so meticulously searched. They were looking for the leverage they needed to finalize their claim. He understood, too, why Blair was so quick to arrest the nephew. It was a distraction, a way to keep the police occupied while Sterling and his associates tied up the loose ends. Hamish stepped out from the shadows, his presence signaled only by the soft crunch of gravel beneath his heavy, worn boots. He didn't rush. He didn't call for backup. He simply stood in the middle of the empty site, his face a calm, unreadable mask. He knew exactly what he had to do next. For the first time in his career, he felt the heavy, lingering sadness of a truth that wouldn't bring anyone peace until the victim was found. He adjusted his cap, his hand resting on the radio at his belt, though he had no intention of using it yet. The hunt had moved from the realm of gossip and suspicion into the world of cold, hard reality. He was the only thing standing between an innocent man and the complete, ruthless power of a machine that saw no value in human life. Chapter 8. The night air had descended into a brittle, biting frost, turning the valley into a landscape of silver-tipped shadows and stark, unforgiving silhouettes. Hamish stood at the edge of the construction site, his mind operating with the cool, calculated precision of a chess master. He had the scrap of the survey map tucked securely into his tunic, and he had the knowledge that Sterling and his consultant were desperate, a dangerous combination that he intended to exploit with the single-minded focus of a predator. He knew that if he approached Blair with his theories, he would be laughed out of the station. He also knew that if he waited, Dougal might not survive the night. He needed to force Sterling's hand. He needed to bring the developer and his consultant into the open, to a place where they would be forced to reveal their connection to the missing Crofter. Hamish pulled his radio from his belt and tuned it to a frequency he knew Blair's team monitored. He wasn't going to report a crime. He was going to leak a rumor, a whisper of discovered evidence that was too tempting for the greedy to ignore. "Dispatch, this is PC Macbeth," he said, his voice crackling with a practiced, nervous urgency. I've found something up here at the old crag. A box. It looks like it might contain documents. I'm going to stay here and guard it until someone can get out here. Do not alert the DCI yet. I need to make sure it's what I think it is before I cause a stir. He knew the radio protocol in the village was loose. He knew that Sterling, who had been keeping a close watch on the police, would be monitoring their communications. He also knew the developer's ego was as inflated as his bank account. If Sterling believed the original deed, the very thing that could ruin him, was sitting unguarded in the hands of a simpleton, he would be unable to resist coming to retrieve it himself. Hamish moved into the shadows of the crag, finding a natural hollow that overlooked the trail leading back to the construction office. He whistled low, and Lugs trotted out of the darkness, settling beside him with a silent, watchful stillness. The dog knew. He felt the tension in Hamish's muscles, the razor-sharp focus that had replaced the usual, lazy drift of his manner. Time crawled by, marked only by the slow, rhythmic sweep of the moonlight across the valley floor. Hamish waited, his eyes fixed on the path. He didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, a dark, unmarked saloon car pulled onto the dirt track near the staging area. Its headlights doused. Two figures stepped out, Sterling and the elegant woman he had seen earlier. They moved with a hurried, aggressive grace, their faces obscured by the collar of their coats. Hamish watched them, his heart a steady, thumping rhythm. They were here, just as he had anticipated. They reached the base of the crag, looking around with a frantic, predator-like intensity. Sterling was muttering, his voice carrying clearly on the still air. "If that fool found the deed, we're finished," Sterling hissed. "We have to find it, burn it, and then deal with the constable. If the police get hold of it, the whole project is dead in the water." "He's a simpleton," the woman replied, her voice cold and devoid of empathy. "He probably doesn't even know what he's holding. Let's just grab the box and leave." They began to climb the path toward the crag, their movements clumsy and hurried. This was the moment. Hamish stood up, his posture shifting, the slumped, weary mask falling away to reveal a man who was, in that moment, the most dangerous person in the glen. He didn't draw a weapon, he didn't shout. He simply stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path, his silhouette large and imposing against the pale light of the moon. "Evening," Hamish said, his voice resonant and calm. "You seem to be looking for something. Would this be it?" He held up a small, empty wooden box he had found near the site, letting them see it in the dim light. Sterling and the woman froze, their faces turning toward him with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. They had underestimated the stupid policeman for the last time. "You," Sterling breathed, his hand disappearing into his coat. "You have no idea what you've started, you pathetic little man." "I think I do," Hamish replied, his voice hardening, his eyes locking onto Sterling's with an intensity that made the developer falter. "I know about Dougal, and I know you have him." The confrontation had begun, and for the first time, Hamish had the advantage. He had set the trap, baited it with the one thing they couldn't resist. And now, in the cold, unforgiving silence of the mountains, the truth was going to be demanded. He waited, his muscles coiled, ready to fight for the man who had been stolen, knowing that this night would end not with the quiet, lazy rhythm of his usual life, but with a reckoning that would echo through the entire valley. Chapter 9. The silence on the mountainside was absolute. A heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to vibrate with the collision of two very different worlds. Sterling stood frozen on the narrow path, his hand still buried inside his coat, his face a mask of predatory shock. The consultant beside him, however, was already recovering, her eyes darting toward the steep drop-off to their right, her mind clearly calculating the odds of a desperate escape. "You really should take your hand out of your coat, Mr. Sterling," Hamish said, his voice quiet and steady, carrying a note of iron that had never once been displayed in the village station. "The ground is treacherous enough as it is. I'd hate for you to trip and fall while carrying something that might go off." Sterling pulled his hand, empty his face, pale beneath the moonlight. "You're making a grave mistake, Constable. You have no idea of the power you're playing with. This is a multi-million-pound development. People have invested heavily in my success. You're just a local policeman in a crumbling station. Nobody will care what happens to you out here in the dark." "I expect that's true," Hamish replied, taking a slow, measured step forward. Lugs moved with him, The dog's hackles raised, his low growl serving as a warning that was impossible to misinterpret. But you see, that's the beauty of living in Lockduff. We don't care much for your money, and we care even less for your power. What we care about is ours. Where is Dougal? The consultant laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that did nothing to hide the panic behind her eyes. He's a squatter. Nothing more, a relic in the way of progress. He's being held at the old limestone works until we can convince him to sign the papers. He's perfectly safe, provided you don't do something suicidal. Hamish didn't blink. He felt the cold air biting at his face, but he was burning with a quiet, focused rage. Safe. I'm sure he feels very safe, trapped in a hole, because he wouldn't sign away his heritage to a man who wouldn't know the value of a sunrise if it hit him in the face. Without warning, Sterling lunged. It was a clumsy, desperate motion, born of ego and a sudden violent realization that he was losing control. He swung, a heavy, gold-ringed fist toward Hamish's head. Hamish, who had spent his life appearing slow and reactive, moved with the sudden, startling speed of a mountain cat. He sidestepped the blow, caught Sterling's wrist in a grip that left no room for movement, and swept the man's legs out from under him. Sterling hit the frozen ground with a grunt of pain and shock, his expensive velvet blazer ruined by the mud. Before the consultant could react, Hamish had pivoted, closing the distance between them and pinning her against the rock face. "Call them," Hamish commanded, his voice cold. "Call the people holding Dougal. Tell them the game is finished. Tell them that if he isn't delivered to the station within the hour, there won't be a project left to salvage, and the police will be tearing down your site office brick by brick to find what you've buried. You'll never get away with this." The woman hissed, struggling against his grip. "I'm not trying to get away with anything," Hamish retorted. "I'm just doing my job. And in Lockduff, work is keeping the peace. Right now, you are the furthest thing from peaceful I've seen in a long, long time." He reached into the woman's coat, retrieving her mobile phone, and handed it to her with a look of icy indifference. "Call them, now." As she shakily dialed the number, Hamish kept a watchful eye on Sterling, who was struggling to pull himself up from the mud, his face a grotesque mask of confusion and bruised pride. The entire scene was a far cry from the lazy, uneventful life Hamish had spent years cultivating, but as he stood there in the dark, he felt a strange, jarring sense of clarity. He wasn't the useless peasant Blair thought him to be, and he wasn't the simpleton Sterling had tried to bully. He was the guardian of the glen, and he had proven in the messiest, most effective way possible that he would defend his own with a ferocity that no city-bred outsider could ever comprehend. The consultant spoke into the phone, her voice tight and hurried, relaying the instructions with a clarity that left no room for debate. Hamish listened, his ears sharp, catching the location mentioned. The old limestone works on the north side of the valley. He gave a single, sharp nod, his hand still tight on her arm. The trap had closed perfectly. He had the developer, he had the confession of the location, and he had the upper hand. The night had turned from a quiet walk in the mountains into a decisive, brutal reclamation of justice. And as the sirens began to wail in the distance, the sound of Blair finally catching up, albeit far too late, Hamish knew that Dougal would be home before dawn. He stood firm, his dog at his side, ready to hand the credit over to the DCI the moment the man arrived, perfectly content to slip back into the shadows once the work was done. Chapter 10. The morning after the arrest, the sun rose over Lockduff with a stubborn, cheerful brightness that seemed entirely inappropriate for the grim events of the previous night. Hamish Macbeth sat in his small, cluttered office, staring at a blank piece of paper that was meant to be his official report. Outside, the village was slowly beginning to stir. He could hear the distant clatter of milk crates and the muffled sound of Mr. Patel opening his shop. It was a normal morning, yet the air felt strangely heavy, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the echo of the night's violence to dissipate. The door to his station swung open without a knock. DCI Blair marched in, his chest puffed out like a bantam rooster, his face still flushed, though now with the glow of self-satisfaction rather than rage. He was clutching a thick file folder, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. Behind him trailed the reporters who had descended on the village at dawn, their cameras clicking and flashes popping in the confined, dusty space of the police station. "Macbeth," Blair barked, his voice filling the cramped space and making the radio on the desk rattle. "I've just come from the press conference. I've laid out the entire case. The arrest of the mastermind, Sterling, the recovery of the victim, Dougal, and the tactical rescue at the limestone works. It's a masterclass in modern police work. I've ensured the press knows that Strathbane took total control the moment the situation escalated." Hamish didn't look up from his desk. He continued to fiddle with his pen, his expression carefully blank, his posture slumped in a way that suggested he was barely conscious. "Aye, sir. I'm sure you did a grand job. The media must be thrilled to have such a clear-cut case to report." Blair leaned over the desk, his eyes narrowing. He had spent the last hour convincing himself that the previous night's chaos was entirely the result of his own brilliant intuition and decisive leadership. "I didn't mention your little adventure at the crag, Macbeth. It was, frankly, an amateurish display of physical bravado that nearly compromised the investigation. I filed the official report as a Strathbane-led operation. I've cited my own strategic oversight in the tactical apprehension of the suspects and the rescue of the victim." Hamish leaned back, letting his jaw slacken just enough to look vacant. "That's right. Kind of you, sir. I'm just a local constable. I don't really know much about strategy or tactics. I'm just happy the village is quiet again and that Dougal is back with his sheep." Blair's expression softened, a flicker of genuine relief crossing his features. He had been terrified that Hamish might try to claim credit, that the village idiot might actually reveal he had orchestrated the entire scenario to force Blair's hand. The fact that Hamish was so willing to retreat into the shadows only confirmed Blair's narrow-minded view of his subordinate. "You're a useful man to have around when you keep your head down, Macbeth," Blair said, his tone bordering on patronizing. "I've decided not to pursue a disciplinary inquiry regarding your unorthodox behavior on the mountainside. Consider it a learning experience. You've had your moment of excitement. Now go back to doing whatever it is you do to fill your time." "Thank you, sir," Hamish said, his voice slow and heavy with feigned gratitude. "I'll get right back to the paperwork. I'm sure it'll take me all day." Blair huffed, straightened his tie, and marched back out toward the press, eager to bask in the flashbulbs. Hamish watched him through the window as he posed for a photo in front of the police station, the DCI beaming with pride. Hamish felt a deep, profound sense of relief. The transfer he had dreaded, the promotion that would have dragged him away to a city desk, it was all gone. Blair would go back to Strathbane, regaling his peers with tales of his own investigative genius, and Hamish would remain here, in the quiet, damp solitude of Lochdubough. The truth of the abduction, the messy, human reality of the corporate conspiracy, would be buried in a file that no one would ever bother to read. It was a small, quiet victory. But in his own way, it was exactly the kind of justice Hamish preferred. He stood up, stretched his lanky frame, and walked over to the stove. The kettle was whistling, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the lingering gloom of the office. He poured a cup of coffee, the steam curling into the cool air, and took a long, slow sip. The taste was bitter, strong, and entirely satisfying. He looked over at Lugs, who was curled up on his rug, one eye open and watching him with patient, canine wisdom. "We did it, Lugs," Hamish whispered, a small, tired smile touching the corners of his mouth. "He thinks he's the hero, and we get to stay in the Highlands. A fair trade, I'd say." He walked over to the window and looked out toward the mountains. The clouds were beginning to break, revealing patches of deep, brilliant blue. The village was returning to its natural rhythm, the pulse of daily life resuming its slow, steady beat. The threat of the development was a shadow that had passed, leaving behind nothing but a lesson that no one would learn, and a story that no one would ever fully understand. He didn't need the recognition. He didn't need the medal or the promotion. He had his freedom, his mountains, and the quiet, secret knowledge of a man who knew exactly how the world worked. He finished his coffee, set the mug down, and walked toward the door, ready to face the day. The case was closed, the records were settled, and as far as the rest of the world was concerned, The most dangerous thing that had happened in Lochdabuff was a case of mistaken identity. He stepped out into the crisp, morning air, feeling lighter than he had in weeks, prepared to sink back into his routine, perfectly happy to be the invisible man in the most beautiful place on earth. Chapter 11. The week that followed the arrest of Sterling and his consultant was one of those rare transcendent periods in Lochdabuff, where the weather seemed to apologize for its previous harshness. The wind had died down to a gentle whisper, and the clouds parted to reveal a sky so blue it looked like an artist had painted it with a single, unhesitating stroke. The mountains, usually looming and foreboding, were bathed in a soft, golden light that made them look almost welcoming. It was the sort of Highland weather that made a man wonder why anyone would ever want to live anywhere else. Hamish Macbeth was back in his natural habitat, the absolute, blissful vacuum of doing nothing. He was sitting on the edge of the old stone pier, his legs dangling over the water, his fishing rod lying forgotten on the mossy wood beside him. Lugs were stretched out in the sun, his ears twitching occasionally at the sound of the gulls. There were no missing crofters to find, no arrogant developers to outwit, and most importantly, no DCI Blair shouting into a radio. The village had largely moved on. The construction crew had packed up their heavy machinery and vanished, leaving behind nothing but a few deep ruts in the earth and the lingering memory of their hubris. The croft at the edge of the glen remained silent and undisturbed, a testament to the fact that some things in the Highlands were simply not meant to be changed. Life in Lochdabuff was like a calm pool. You could throw a rock into it, and for a few moments, the ripples would spread and disturb the surface. But soon enough, the water would settle, and everything would be as it had been before. Hamish took a slow sip of the coffee he had brought from the hotel. It was rich, hot, and tasted infinitely better than the thin, watery liquid he usually brewed on his own stove. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the sun soak into his bones. He felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He had survived another brush with ambition, another attempt by the outside world to drag him into its messy, complicated machinery, and he had come out the other side entirely unscathed. He thought about the case, fleetingly. He thought about Dougal, who was back in his croft, tending to his sheep as if he had never been gone. There was no joy in the thought, only a quiet, melancholy acceptance. The world was full of people like Sterling people who carried their greed like a weapon, waiting for the day they could carve a piece of the world into their own image. Hamish knew he couldn't stop them all, and he certainly couldn't force the world to be a place where justice was always clean and simple. All he could do was watch, listen, and occasionally, when the need was dire, nudge the scales just enough to keep the chaos from consuming the village he loved. A soft, familiar footstep sounded on the wooden planks behind him. Hamish didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew the crisp, rhythmic tap of her heels, the light, expensive fragrance of her perfume that always seemed to cut through the smell of salt and fish. "I thought I might find you here," Priscilla said, her voice soft. "Aye," Hamish replied, still looking at the water. "It's a good day for contemplating the scenery. Or, more accurately, contemplating not contemplating anything at all." Priscilla sat on the pier a few feet away from him, her posture perfect, her coat immaculate. She looked at the lock, her expression unreadable. "The village is talking, you know. They say the developer was just a man who didn't understand the geography of the Highlands. They say the kidnapping was a terrible, tragic misunderstanding of local property laws. They usually get the story wrong in the end," Hamish said, picking up his rod and giving it a half-hearted tug, "even if the details are all wrong." Priscilla turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "You did well, Hamish, not just with the rescue, but with how you handled it. Blair is still telling everyone he cracked the case, and you're still the lazy local copper. You gave up fame for your own peace of mind. Not many men would do that." "I'm not a man of glory, Priscilla," Hamish said with a wry, tired smile. "I'm a man of habit. Glory is far too exhausting. It requires too much maintenance." Priscilla laughed, a rare, genuine sound that made the air feel suddenly, inexplicably lighter. "I suppose you're right. You're a terrible, infuriating, impossible man, Hamish Macbeth." "Aye," he agreed, watching a small silver fish jump in the distance. But I'm a local, and that's what counts. She stood up after a few moments, brushing off her coat. I'm leaving for London tomorrow. My parents think the Highlands are a bit much after the events of the last few days. They are a bit much, Hamish conceded. They aren't for everyone. I'll miss it, she said, and for a fleeting second the armor of her social standing dropped, revealing a loneliness that mirrored his own. I'll miss the quiet. The quiet will be here when you come back, he said, turning to look at her. She offered him a small, sad smile, then turned and walked back toward the village, her silhouette becoming smaller and smaller against the bright, open landscape. Hamish watched her go, then turned his gaze back to the water. He was alone again, but it wasn't a lonely kind of solitude. It was the solitude of a man who belonged to the land, who felt the pulse of the hills in his own heartbeat. He stood up, whistled for lugs, and began the slow, easy walk back to his cottage. The evening shadows were beginning to lengthen, the world turning into a soft, golden blur of peace. He had his pot of stew, waiting on the stove, a warm bed, and a life that was exactly as he wanted it to be. He was home, and for Hamish Macbeth, that was the only truth that ever really mattered.